Elvis stopped singing mid-song, dropped his microphone, and 50,000 people in the stadium fell into dead silence. What happened next became one of the most extraordinary moments in music history, proving that sometimes the greatest performances happen when the music stops. It was July 15, 1975, at the Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum in New York. Elvis Presley was at the height of his comeback era, commanding stages with a presence that could move mountains. But tonight would be different. Tonight, one heartbroken fan in the crowd would change everything, and Elvis would prove that beneath the glittering jumpsuits and larger-than-life persona lived a man whose greatest superpower wasn't his voice, it was his heart. The evening started like any other Elvis concert. Thousands of fans packed into the arena, their anticipation electric. When the house lights dimmed and those first iconic notes of "Also Sprach Zarathustra" thundered through the speakers, the crowd erupted. Then he appeared, Elvis Aaron Presley, the king of rock and roll, striding onto the stage in his white jumpsuit adorned with golden eagles, his presence commanding every eye in the building. For the first hour, it was pure Elvis magic. "Love Me Tender" had grandmothers wiping away tears. "Hound Dog" had teenagers screaming at the top of their lungs. "Can't Help Myself" had the entire arena swaying as one. Elvis moved across that stage like lightning in human form, his voice soaring over the crowd, each song building the energy higher and higher. But then, in the middle of "The Wonder of You," something changed. Elvis was reaching the crescendo, his voice floating over the mesmerized crowd. "The wonder of you is the wonder of knowing that someone like you could love someone like me." When suddenly his eyes caught something in the audience that made his blood run cold. There, in the third row, sat a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, with tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of joy like the thousands of others around her. These were tears of pure, devastating grief. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and in her trembling hands, she clutched what appeared to be a photograph. Elvis stopped singing mid-word. The entire band continued playing behind him, but his voice had simply vanished from the song. 50,000 people held their breath as the king of rock and roll stood frozen on stage, staring into the crowd. Without warning, Elvis handed his microphone to a backup singer, stepped to the edge of the stage, and pointed directly at the crying woman. Security immediately understood, Elvis wanted to see this fan, and when Elvis wanted something, it happened. Within minutes, the young woman was backstage, still clutching that photograph, her face streaked with tears. Her name was Linda Morrison, and she had traveled from Ohio with her life savings to see Elvis perform. But she hadn't come alone. She had planned to come with her younger brother, Tommy, who had been battling leukemia for 2 years. Tommy Morrison had been Elvis's biggest fan since he was 7 years old. His hospital room was covered wall-to-wall with Elvis posters, and during his worst days of chemotherapy, Tommy would listen to "Love Me Tender" on repeat, telling his sister it made the pain go away. He had begged Linda for months to take him to an Elvis concert, and when she finally saved enough money for 2 tickets, Tommy's excitement was infectious. But 3 days before the concert, Tommy lost his battle with cancer. He was just 14 years old. Linda had come to the show anyway, carrying her brother's favorite photograph of Elvis and wearing the matching "Elvis Lives" t-shirt they had bought together. She hadn't planned to cry, she thought she could make it through the show as a tribute to Tommy. But when Elvis sang "The Wonder of You," the song that Tommy hummed during his final week, the grief overwhelmed her completely. Backstage, Linda told Elvis the entire story through broken sobs, showing him the photograph Tommy had treasured, a picture of Elvis signing autographs for sick children at St. Jude Hospital. Elvis took the photograph in his hands and stared at it for a long moment, his own eyes beginning to well up. "What was his favorite song, honey?" Elvis asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Love Me Tender," Linda replied. He said it reminded him that someone, somewhere, was thinking about him. Elvis nodded slowly, then did something that stunned his entire crew. He walked back toward the stage, still carrying Tommy's photograph, and gestured for Linda to follow him. The arena was still buzzing with confusion when Elvis walked back on stage, this time accompanied by a young woman most of the audience had never seen before. He moved to center stage, raised his hand for absolute silence, and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis said, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive venue, "I want to tell you about a young man named Tommy Morrison. Tommy was 14 years old, and he loved music more than anything in this world. He fought harder than any soldier I've ever known, but last week, God called him home." The arena fell silent. Not the excited quiet of an audience waiting for a song, but the sacred silence of 50,000 people understanding they were witnessing something profound. "Tommy's sister Linda is here with us tonight," Elvis continued, placing his hand gently on Linda's shoulder. "She traveled here from Ohio to honor her brother's memory, and I think Tommy deserves more than just a song, he deserves to know his love reached all the way to this stage." Elvis walked to his piano, sat down, and looked out at the sea of faces. "Tommy, if you can hear us, this is for you, son." What happened next would be talked about for decades. Elvis began playing "Love Me Tender" on the piano, but instead of singing it in his usual powerful style, he sang it like a lullaby, soft and intimate, as if he were singing directly to Tommy Morrison in heaven. But here's where the miracle happened. By the second verse, Linda began singing along through her tears. Then a few people in the front row joined in. Then dozens. Then hundreds. By the final chorus, all 50,000 people in that arena were singing "Love Me Tender" together, their voices creating a sound so beautiful and powerful that even the veteran musicians on stage were moved to tears. When the song ended, Elvis stood up from the piano and did something he had never done before in his entire career. He took off his personal gold necklace, the one he wore to every single performance, and placed it around Linda's neck. "This is for Tommy," he said. "So a part of this night stays with him forever." The arena erupted in the longest standing ovation in Nassau Coliseum history. But Elvis wasn't finished. Subscribe now and leave a comment because what Elvis did next became the most legendary moment of his career. Elvis reached into his jacket and pulled out a silk scarf, one of the hundreds he gave to fans during every show. But instead of tossing it into the crowd like usual, he carefully wrapped Tommy's photograph in it, creating a small, sacred bundle. "Linda," he said, "I want you to bury this with Tommy. Tell him Elvis Presley sang for him personally, and tell him that every time I perform 'Love Me Tender' from now on, I'll be thinking of his courage." As Linda walked off the stage, clutching both the necklace and the wrapped photograph, something extraordinary happened. Elvis didn't immediately launch into his next song. Instead, he stood at the edge of the stage and began shaking hands with fans in the front rows, looking each person in the eye and saying a few personal words. For the next 20 minutes, Elvis turned that concert into something unprecedented, an intimate conversation with 50,000 people. He told stories, he answered questions shouted from the crowd, he even invited a Vietnam veteran on stage to sing "American Trilogy" with him. The show that night ran 2 hours longer than scheduled, but nobody left. Nobody complained. They all understood they were witnessing the king of rock and roll at his most human, most vulnerable, most real. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months later, Linda received a package at her home in Ohio with no return address. Inside was a gold record of "Love Me Tender" with an engraving that read, "For Tommy Morrison, who taught us all what real courage looks like. Thank you for sharing your love with us. Elvis Presley." Accompanying the record was a handwritten letter from Elvis, explaining that he had established a small fund at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Tommy's name, and that a portion of proceeds from every future concert would be donated to children fighting cancer. For the rest of his career, Elvis kept his promise. Every single time he performed "Love Me Tender" at concerts, he would pause before the song and say, "This one's for Tommy Morrison and all the kids who show us what real strength looks like." That gold necklace Linda wore that night. She never took it off. She wore it to her wedding, to the birth of her children, and to every major moment of her life. When local reporters asked her about it years later, she would simply smile and say, "This is my reminder that kindness is the greatest superpower of all." But here's the most incredible part of this story. The part no one expected. In 1995, 20 years after that concert, Linda Morrison Williams, she had married and taken her husband's name, was working as a pediatric nurse at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. One day, while caring for a 7-year-old boy with leukemia, she noticed he had an Elvis poster by his bed. "Do you like Elvis?" she asked him. "He's my hero," the little boy replied. "My mom says Elvis used to sing for sick kids, and that makes me feel better when I'm scared." Linda smiled, reached into her pocket, and pulled out a small recorder. "Would you like to hear something special?" she asked. What Linda had never told anyone was that she had secretly recorded Elvis's entire speech and performance that night in 1975. For 20 years, she had kept that cassette tape private, listening to it only when she missed her brother Tommy the most. But now, she began playing that tape for every child she treated. Elvis's voice, singing "Love Me Tender" with 50,000 people in memory of Tommy Morrison, became the unofficial anthem of the pediatric ward. The story spread. Other nurses requested copies. Doctors started mentioning that Elvis taped to families. Within a year, Linda's secret recording had been heard by thousands of children and families facing their darkest moments. Share this video and subscribe because this story shows us that sometimes the greatest acts of love happen when we think no one is watching. In 2007, Linda finally decided to share the recording publicly. She released it as part of a charity album called Tommy's Song, Elvis's Promise, with all proceeds going to pediatric cancer research. The album included not just that famous performance, but also testimonials from dozens of children and families who had been comforted by hearing Elvis's compassionate words during their own battles. Today, if you visit St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, you'll find a small plaque in the main lobby. It reads, "In memory of Tommy Morrison and in honor of Elvis Presley, who showed us that the greatest performances happen when we stop performing and start caring." The gold necklace Elvis gave to Linda that night. It's now on display at the Elvis Presley Museum, but Linda insisted on one condition. Next to it sits Tommy's photograph, still wrapped in Elvis's silk scarf, exactly as the king had prepared it 48 years ago. Every year on July 15th, the anniversary of that concert, Linda returns to the museum and spends a few minutes looking at that display. Visitors often see an elderly woman standing there, sometimes humming "Love Me Tender" softly to herself. When people ask museum staff who she is, they simply say, "That's the woman who reminded Elvis that his greatest superpower wasn't his voice, it was his heart." But there's one more detail about that night that Linda never shared publicly until recently. After the concert ended and the arena emptied, Elvis's security team found something extraordinary. Scattered throughout the venue were dozens of personal items that fans had left behind, not forgotten, but deliberately placed as tributes. Wedding rings from couples who had danced to "Love Me Tender" at their ceremonies. Military dog tags from veterans who found comfort in Elvis's patriotic songs. Hospital bracelets from patients who had snuck out to attend the show. Even children's stuffed animals, placed carefully on seats with handwritten notes attached. The notes all said variations of the same thing, "For Tommy Morrison and all the kids like him. Thank you, Elvis, for showing us how to love." Elvis spent 2 hours after the show reading every single note. His bodyguard later recalled that the king sat in his dressing room, surrounded by these tokens of love, and wept like a child. "I never knew," Elvis kept saying. "I never knew music could heal like this." That night changed Elvis's entire approach to performing. From that moment forward, before every concert, he would spend 10 minutes backstage not warming up his voice or checking his appearance, but reading letters from fans who were going through difficult times. He called it his heart preparation. His band members noticed the difference immediately. Elvis's performances became more intimate, more connected. He would scan the crowd differently now, looking not just for the excited faces, but for the ones that needed hope. He would extend songs when he sensed someone in the audience needed extra time with the music. The ripple effect of Tommy Morrison's story continued for decades. In the 1980s, a young nurse named Patricia Collins was working with AIDS patients in San Francisco when she remembered hearing about Elvis's Nassau Coliseum performance. She began playing Elvis recordings for her patients, and found that "Love Me Tender" had an almost miraculous calming effect during their most painful treatments. Patricia started what she called the Elvis Protocol, using music therapy specifically with Elvis songs to help terminally ill patients find peace. The protocol spread to hospitals across America, and by 1990, over 200 medical facilities were using Elvis's music as part of their palliative care programs. When Patricia tracked down Linda Morrison Williams to tell her about this development, Linda shared something that stunned her. Elvis had apparently predicted this would happen. In his handwritten letter to Linda, there was a line she had never mentioned to anyone: "Music is medicine, honey." Tommy knew that, and someday the whole world will know it too. Because that night in Nassau Coliseum, Elvis Presley proved something that transcended music, fame, or entertainment. He proved that in our darkest moments, sometimes all we need is for someone to see us, to acknowledge our pain, and to remind us that love, true, unconditional love, never dies. Tommy Morrison's favorite song was "Love Me Tender." But what he truly loved was the message behind it, that somewhere in this world, someone cares enough to sing away your pain. And on July 15, 1975, the king of rock and roll made sure that message reached not just one heartbroken sister, but an entire world of people who needed to remember that love always finds a way.